Are we good? All right. Welcome to Cigar Thoughts, the podcast. I appreciate you guys joining us. As you can see, a little bit of a different setting this week. We are bringing this broadcast to you from the comfort of our various homes. With me this week are the editor-in-chief of Field Goals. You know him, Danny Kelly. Danny, how you doing today?
Doing well, Jackson. Thanks for having me on this week.
Yeah, of course, man. I appreciate you making the time. And joining me is Matt Nichols. And those of you who've been watching this podcast are obviously familiar with him, his experience, the knowledge he brings. If you're not, uh, Matt was an all-conference offensive lineman at Pacific Lutheran University, won a national championship there, and just sort of has a beautiful mind when it comes to the game of football. So always excited to have him joining us. Matt, how you doing?
I'm fantastic. That was a fun game on Sunday, and I'm excited to talk about it today.
Yeah, yeah, it was looking for a bit like Matt wasn't going to be able to join us this week, and that would have been a bummer. And I'm actually really sad to not be getting Brent's thoughts this week too because it was such just a wild game. But Matt, yeah, you brought it up. The word you used was fun. What stood out to you most about the game against the Steelers?
It felt like a Rocky Balboa movie where it was two heavyweights just throwing blow after blow after blow with each other, and you were just waiting for somebody to let their guard down to get knocked out, and that really came on the Doug Baldwin 80-yard touchdown. Was kind of the knockout shot right there. That was an absolutely fantastic game, and we haven't seen those kinds of games as Seahawk fans lately, just because we've had such a powerful defense where we didn't need to go and score 39 points to win a game. We can win with 21 points. We were playing a team that was just potent on offense, who had basically given up on the running game, and every time they passed, we're going to try to chuck it downfield. It was very reminiscent of the Cardinals game in some ways, but we didn't beat ourselves as we did in the Cardinals game. We got 4 turnovers this game, which really were huge momentum swings for us. And it just played out as one of those games where, as a fan, as a Seahawks fan watching it, I kept getting a little nervous, but it was just a fun game to watch.
Yeah, I mean, it was. And Matt, you and I last week talked about the similarities offensively between Arizona and Pittsburgh, which is why I wasn't shocked to see Pittsburgh pass the ball well. I wasn't expecting them to throw for more yards than Seattle's ever allowed before, but I was expecting them to have success through the air, and it's because the way that you beat the Seahawks is either have an otherworldly quick release talent like Tom Brady, or have a big armed quarterback that can go over the top and have the receivers to go get it. And Pittsburgh's got that in spades. But what I was most impressed by was Seattle's ability to keep answering the bell. Every time Seattle scored, I'll admit, I thought, okay, they got one, good. Now we got to hold them. And every time Pittsburgh came right back and scored, and especially after the Jimmy Graham injury, I was pleasantly surprised to see how consistently they just came out and scored touchdowns. And not just points and ball control and yards and whatever. Actual, tangible, tradable touchdowns that have real worth towards winning football games. And it was really, really cool to see that.
And explosive plays too. I mean,
Yeah.
it wasn't little things. It was explosive plays. It was after the Richard Sherman interception that we're going to throw it to Jimmy Graham down to the 2-yard line.
Oh, I'm
And
glad his last catch was what it was. If it was
oh, it
his
was
last catch of the season,
yeah,
that was
it
his
was an
best one.
unbelievable play by him to make that happen with 2 defenders there. But they just had over and over there was explosive plays. Rawls and we learned after the game that Rawls was pretty sick this week, that Russell Wilson was pretty sick going into the game. Rawls looked good in the running game. Tufuwaku going out, it was obvious that they made an adjustment to it. And I thought it was also one of the things where they didn't really show that they could slow Pittsburgh down significantly. I mean, it was either kind of like a touchdown or a turnover type deal with Pittsburgh. So we really had to score those touchdowns and get those chunk yardage plays, and Seattle was able to do that all game long.
Danny, what were your takeaways from that game? Because I know you're pretty familiar with the Steelers model and what it is that they try to do and what they're best at. Was that game what you were expecting?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the Steelers, it definitely was. I picked the Steelers in this game, and so I'm happy to be wrong about that. But I feel like they kind of did what I expected them to do, which is threw the ball like crazy. Obviously Richard Sherman held Antonio Brown in check, and that was awesome. But giving up 200 yards to an opposing receiver is kind of crazy in the first place. And like you said, the most passing yardage they've ever given up in a game, which is pretty insane to think about. But the key thing for that was two stats. One, obviously, the 4 turnovers were huge. The Seahawks defense was able to get, but the Seahawks only gave up 1 passing touchdown. So that was huge too. Obviously the Martavis Bryant rushing touchdown kind of that was a frustrating play. And there was certain plays during the game where you're just like, man, they're just not the same defense that we're used to. They're just not as good. And Earl Thomas was kind of coming up short on a couple of plays and getting out of position and things like that. But overall, getting those turnovers was, the difference in the game, obviously. And so you have to be really happy about that. I think, obviously, 538 yards of offense isn't ideal, but getting those 4 turnovers was just huge. And hopefully those will continue to come. They always say they come in bunches. I could actually really see that continue, as the year goes on. They start doing that a little more consistently.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's very rarely this year, and Seattle has shown themselves to be soft against good pass offenses. Let's call it what it is.
Yeah.
But how often has it been the best receiver on the other team beating them? Right? It's like that check down thing where when Seattle's reserves were Byron Maxwell and Walter Thurmond, and those are the quality of players that they could bring in to cover the 3rd and 4th receivers. We gave all the credit to their pass defense in the past to the starters, but really they were so deep with coverage ability. As we get to this point in the NFL season, you're starting to see a lot of turnover in terms of starting positions. And one thing that we saw this week was Deshaun Shedd get the start at outside corner in place of Kerry Williams. Danny, when you watched that game, I know that you had a special eye on that matchup, and since Sherman was following Antonio Brown around, I think it was on Bryant mostly, but what did you see from Shedd, and did you think it was an improvement over Kerry?
Yeah, he had a really good game, actually, all things considered. Obviously, I wonder if that was his first start at corner in his career. It could have been, obviously because he came in relief last week. But the bottom line is I think he played pretty well. He had 4 pass breakups, which is awesome. There was a couple plays where Ben Roethlisberger just laid the ball up like perfectly over a shoulder, and there's really nothing you can just do about that. Like, you're going to give up plays like that sometimes. But overall, I think he did well. In terms of the giving up of a huge amount of pass yards, I think there was some, there's blame to be passed around. I think the linebackers didn't do as good of a job as you could have hoped in terms of their drops. I think that having Marcus Burley get hurt was kind of a big issue because Jeremy Lane ended up playing like almost the whole second half, it felt like. And he was just not ready to be in that situation. He actually, all things considered, like I said, he played all right. Jeremy Lane did, but as Pete Carroll said after the game, that was kind of like his first preseason game after 9 months away. You're going to expect some rustiness in there. It definitely showed. But yeah, I mean, I think Shedd looked good, and it goes back a couple of years. I remember seeing him play corner in the preseason, and I was just like, this guy is probably better at corner than he is at safety. I remember thinking that. And so it hasn't surprised me terribly that he's ended up being more of a corner for them. They say he can play all the positions. They say he can play safety. I even heard today someone, I think maybe Pete Carroll or Sherman, said he could play Mike for him if they really needed it. But I like him as a corner. He's kind of long, fast, athletic, physical. He's sort of like a hybrid of Browner and Maxwell in the sense that he's a little bit bigger than normal corners are, but he's also physical and fast. So I think he'll just get better as he gets more experience. I actually like him out there.
Yeah, Matt, did you You see the same thing?
I really liked watching Deshaun play. Going back there, one of the things that coaches always talk about, and I can tell you is for a fact, is there's no way you can get in condition for a game without actually playing in a game. So for Jeremy Lane to come in and play that many snaps on special teams and then on defense was a yeoman's effort on his part. I mean, that was really, really hard for him to get thrust into that many. And again, these aren't pass patterns. I think one of the things people forget, too, with our secondary, these aren't pass patterns that the Patriots run or that the San Francisco 49ers run where they're 5, 10, 12-yard routes. These are 40 and 60-yard routes over and over and over and over again. Our corners, statistically, was not pretty. But if you look at it in total, it really, really wasn't bad at all. I didn't think. I thought Deshaun Shedd did a nice job of staying on top. There were definitely some times where the safeties weren't able to get there to help out. And, of course, you're going to give up some big plays. But I thought all in all, the secondary, again, not the prettiest of effort, but good enough to, especially getting the 3 turnovers on defense and then Lane's 4th one on the special teams play. Those were huge. Those were deciding things. We haven't gotten turnovers like that this year. If we don't get those in this game, we lose. So they did what they needed to do. And honestly, who gives a rat's ass about giving up yards if you're not giving up huge amounts of points? And to hold that offense when Ben is throwing like that and hitting Bryant over 2 defenders, to only give up 30 while it sucks isn't horrible. So all in all, I was very happy. And again, win by 1.
Right. Yeah. And for as many yards and completions as the Seahawks gave up, I think if you told Pete Carroll, hey, you're going to give up every game, you're going to give up 480 yards passing, but only 1 touchdown and get 4 interceptions, I think that he would take it. Ultimately, outside, that's just a shit ton of yards. But today's game favors teams that are set up the way that Pittsburgh is when it comes to the passing game, and teams like that are just going to get a lot of yards. I mean, Antonio Brown had 300 yards from scrimmage a couple weeks ago by himself. It's just that's who they are. But it's when they're from the 20-yard line and in, can you keep them from getting in the end zone? And Seattle did that. The only pass touchdown they gave up was the bomb to Wheaton, which doesn't happen often with this team. So I want
to say something really quick about that too.
Yeah.
My coach at PLU, Frosty, always had something he would always say, and he would say stats are for losers, and really it's true. This is about the way the game ends and how it goes and the ebb and flow of it, and really who cares what the stats were as long as your team came out on top in the end. And they played well. And I've always kind of gone back to that. We're in a day and age where every stat is hyper-focused to the nth degree. But really, I always kind of come back to what my coach, who is in the top 10 victories in all of college football history at any level, always said, stats are for losers. And I'm a big believer in that. And this was one of those games that, again, who gives a crap about the stats? They got the W, and they're going forward, and they put themselves in a great position that now – they're in the sixth playoff spot, and 2 weeks ago we were talking about is this season over.
Yeah, and you're right, and I think that the one thing I'll say is, and you don't hear Danny and I lean on yards
exactly
ever,
yeah.
But I think that just to say, and I'm familiar with Frosty and kind of how revolutionarily successful he was as well, but I do think that there are some stats that are more telling than others. But if you're just looking at who gained more yards or completed more passes, yeah, I mean, there's just not a high correlation to winning. And so that's why the fact that they got almost 500 yards passing and did get over 500 yards total offense doesn't bug me a whole lot moving forward, just because I don't think there's many teams who can do that.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting. And Matt, you just mentioned that this win gets them into the 6th spot as far as the playoffs go. We haven't really talked on this podcast yet this year much about playoffs and games that they need to win and what it means. But for the first time in a long time, the Seahawks have a clear path to the playoffs. And if they hold serve, they get in. Are they, Danny, I want to know from you, someone who's covered this team so closely in the Pete Carroll era, is what we're seeing that same second half surge that we've seen from really 2011 on, or is this just they got away with one and we'll see what happens next week?
I mean, it's really tough to know because they've been really inconsistent this year, even more so maybe than they have been in the past, but it does feel like they're kind of hitting their stride in a lot of areas. I think the Jimmy Graham thing is kind of a bummer because he was really coming on strong for them in terms of in the third down area. They were able to convert some third and longs with him that they normally wouldn't get, I don't think. And he's been a factor in the red zone even though he hasn't caught touchdowns because he's drawing a lot of coverage in his area and all that. So going forward, it'll be interesting to see kind of what happens with the offense without him. But it was really encouraging to see Russell Wilson play because the offensive line feels like it's starting to come together, and that'll be really, really huge for the stretch run. Yeah, so I mean, to me, it's more of a question of what they do on defense. I think the offense is going in the right direction and starting to feel like maybe they're playing their best football of the year and going in the right direction. But I don't know still about the defense. I don't know if they're as good or as stout as they have been in the last couple of years. So maybe the offense will have to pick it up and kind of carry them a little bit. So, but I do think that they're going in the right direction. For whatever reason, Pete Carroll's able to get this team going towards the end of the season. I know he has some sort of formula for doing that that we don't know about, and maybe he doesn't even really know about. But it just goes back so far and is so consistent that I have to believe that they're going in that direction again.
Yeah, it's interesting. Danny, you and I touched on it briefly during the Deep Balls podcast, but it's something where this is just when they do it, when the length and brutality of the NFL season starts to wear on everyone. It's like the way that the Seahawks go about their business for whatever reason seems to start thriving, and whether it's just because they don't see as much attrition from fatigue or whatever that other teams do, or if they're really finding an extra gear, I just think that each year they're kind of using those first 2 months to really figure out who they are and figure out what is it that this team does well, what is it that we struggle with, how can we maximize situations where we're taking advantage of what this team does well. And this is a different team than the one they've had the last couple of years, but they've had to figure out their identity every year, and they've always done it by November 1st. And I truly think that that's what we're seeing. And I think that what we're seeing is a different identity than the one that we expected, than the one that we've seen the last 3 years. That game that they won on Sunday, that was a totally different type of game than they've won even in the last few years. They weren't winning a bunch of crazy shootouts. And to show that they can do that, and for them to be as efficient offensively for the final 45 minutes of that game, I mean, it was a sight to behold. So to me, the way that I'm seeing this is a team that tried to do what's worked for them in the past, and it didn't work as well, and they spent that middle part of the season figuring out what would work. And believe it or not, the loss of Marshawn is a catalyst for that. I mean, Thomas Rawls is giving them a gear that they just haven't had all season. No knock on Lynch. He's been playing hurt. But, I mean, Rawls is, I think, a truly special talent and gives them the ability to be a faster offense than they've been in past years.
Yeah, Kenny tweeted it out actually the other day. Thomas Rawls actually is now first in terms of DYAR, DVOA, and success rate across the board. So, in other words, he's the most valuable running back in the NFL in total. He's the most
it doesn't cost anything.
Yeah, he's the most valuable per play, and his success rate is the highest in terms of any running back in the NFL. In other words, he's the most consistently good running back. So he's just been amazing, and I keep waiting for sort of the other shoe to drop, but it just hasn't yet. He just looks really, really good consistently, and that's been big. I do think they might be adapting a little bit to kind of what they've had happen, Maybe we do see a little bit different style going forward here in terms of they might throw the ball a little bit more, lean on Russell Wilson a little bit more, and we've seen them go away from the read option a lot this year. It's kind of not really that big a part of their offense anymore. It's kind of more like a gadget, or not a gadget, but like just a constraint play they'll run every once in a while. So yeah, I mean it's interesting to see what will happen this last couple weeks of the season, and if they can kind of change their identity a little bit in terms of what they do on offense and if it works well.
Yeah, it's super interesting to see. Matt, when you look at this offense and you see Thomas Rawls in there, and instead of Marshawn Lynch, and now you're seeing Luke Wilson and Cooper Helfett instead of Jimmy Graham, to your eye, what does that change about the Seahawks philosophically, if anything, when it comes to their offense?
I think the biggest thing for them is they have gotten their offensive line back in order, and by getting that back in order, it is allowing them to expand and just do what they do. I was loving watching Jimmy Graham because they were trying to isolate him in so many different ways, and it was great. I mean, we saw them coming out with Jimmy Graham to the left and 4 receivers in a bunch formation to the right, straight isolated Jimmy Graham. That's not something that we've seen them do, and that is strictly because they're trying to get a matchup with Jimmy. Now, we're not going to be able to see that probably going forward because they don't have anybody on their offense that commands the defense like Jimmy does. But what we're seeing is Jermaine Kearse get back involved with the offense. Doug Baldwin as of the last 3 games, has just been on fire. Lockett has been there. Luke Wilson has been very good. This is a team that, it kind of reminds me of the old Seattle Supersonics, where it would have like Gary Payton and Sean Kemp, but people didn't realize how good Ricky Pierce and Hersey Hawkins and all of those little surrounding players were. And the Seahawks are kind of built the same way, where they have Marshawn, and in a couple of weeks they'll have him back, but they always have Russell. But it's all of these other people on the outside that nobody ever notices. And I texted both of you gentlemen earlier this week. Has there ever been a game in NFL history in which 39 points or more were scored and none of the people scoring points were drafted in the NFL?
That was crazy. When you sent that to me, I was just like, holy cow, you're entirely right. But
Hauschka, Rawls, Kearse, and Baldwin. 39 points. None of the 4 were drafted. That is insane.
It's crazy.
That is absolutely insane how good that is. How good they are at finding talent. So, their offense is going to change because it has to without Jimmy. Jimmy just commanded defenses, and we've really got to see it in the last few weeks. He was clutch on those 3rd and longs. He's been very good. All season we've been struggling to get him into a rhythm, and quite honestly, the first 5 weeks of the season when we couldn't keep Russell upright, people were saying, well, where's Jimmy? That's not on Jimmy. That's on the offensive line and not being able to give Russell time. We saw this game, Russell getting the ball out of his hands fast, and I know both of you guys probably know the statistics faster than I, but from just my naked eye watching, he was getting the ball and he was making a good decision and getting the ball out immediately.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter who he has at receivers. If he's able to do that and spread the ball around, this is going to be a very explosive offense going over. The other thing I really liked is that the ball was going outside of the hash marks, outside of the numbers, and inside of the hash marks. What I mean by that is that ball was getting spread around the whole field. It wasn't like if you took away the right flat, you took away everywhere Russell was throwing. He was throwing it deep. He was throwing it ins. He was throwing outs. He was throwing posts. He was throwing comebacks. Everything was there. And by doing that, again, that allows a defense not to key in on anything.
Yeah.
Do you think that, either of you, that losing Jimmy Graham in some way gives Darrell Bevell and Pete Carroll more freedom with play calling?
I think that it's going to be it might be easier for Bevell to do what's best in terms of the flow of the game rather than trying to, feed Marshawn or feed Jimmy in terms of, because there is a lot of pressure externally to get those guys involved and internally. I mean, with Marshawn, I think he's probably pissed if he's not getting a lot of carries and he lets people know about it. I don't know if Jimmy was doing that, but there's definitely the external pressure to get him involved, and they ask him about it every single week. So that maybe there's a little bit of that in terms of This way, the Seahawks can kind of do what they do in terms of every week there's a different guy that's kind of highlighted in the game plan. Maybe that will change things. I don't think the Seahawks offense is better now that Jimmy Graham is off the field. Frankly, I just think he's a really, really good player. Gives them an element that they hadn't had in a long time. And it is a big hit for them to lose him. That said, I think because of what you were saying in terms of the freedom for Bevel to do, it could be less of a drop-off than you might think. So, in other words, I'm not on board with the whole rationalization that the Seahawks offense is going to be better without Jimmy Graham. But I think because of that factor, it could be not as bad as people might think. So, if they end up being better along the line, that'll be interesting. But I really do think it'll probably be more because Russell Wilson's improving and the offensive line is improving, and not because they lost Jimmy Graham. Go ahead.
Oh, it'll be interesting because there's going to be a very tempting correlation to make if the offense continues to trend that they're better without Jimmy Graham. But let me just remind anyone thinking that it just comes down to stuff like that. The Chiefs
binary.
Chiefs are 1-5 with Jamal Charles and 5-0 without him. Like sometimes it's just not that simple, Offenses develop identities as they go, and I mean, how many times has Russell Wilson been sacked in the last 3 weeks? Is it like 2?
Something like that, yeah.
I mean, of course the offense is going to look better when your quarterback goes from getting sacked 6 times a game to getting sacked 1 time a game. I mean, that just changes a ton of things in terms of play calling and confidence and rhythm and execution. So, I think that there might be a little bit more creative freedom in play calling without Jimmy Graham. I don't think that they're better. But I think that the Seahawks have figured out a formula that sort of allows them to hit their stride offensively in the second half of the year. We've seen it every single season, and I think we're just starting to see more of the same.
Well, and this isn't just something that Pete Carroll's programs have done with the Seahawks. Go back to the USC days. I mean, what was his record in November, December, and January at USC? It was unreal.
No lose November.
Yeah, exactly. His teams always get better, and it's kind of that philosophy of his where, I mean, he talks about learning the learners, and I know we've talked about this before, but this offense has to adjust without Jimmy. Jimmy was able to do some things, and we really saw it this last game when they were so successful on the 3rd and longs. I mean, what were they, 5 for 5 on 3rd and 10 or longer? And 3 of those were to Jimmy, where it was straight isolation plays. So they're going to have to adjust the offense, but it's not going to be an adjustment of an offense like, let's say, the Denver Broncos losing Peyton Manning and having to do a seismic adjustment, or if the New England Patriots were to lose Tom Brady, where it's a seismic adjustment. They have to adjust. Luke Wilson is a very good tight end, but he's no Jimmy Graham, and he doesn't command a defense like a Jimmy Graham does. So even when Jimmy's not compiling the stats that all of us, again, people want to see, he is freeing up guys to get better matchups all around the field. So unfortunately, that's going away. But this is a team that has been able to put points up on the board, score, and be very successful the last 3 years without Jimmy Graham being here.
What's interesting is, that's a lot of slack to pick up. And maybe it's not a ton of statistical slack, as the Seahawks receiving stats have been pretty evenly spread this season. But in terms of now everyone gets a few degrees more attention from the defense with Jimmy Graham out. The guy that has impressed me the most besides Rawls in terms of just being able to sort of weather the storm on offense is Doug Baldwin, who I think is playing the best football of his career right now. And, I mean, I think that he was the difference in that game. That 80-yard touchdown play, which happened to be the longest of the season, longest play from scrimmage of the season for the Seahawks, might have been the most important play too. It looked really fluid and easy when it happened live at full speed. But Danny, you pointed out earlier this week, that ball hits him on his back hip at full speed. As you put it, the ball caught him. And if he has to stutter for a second to bobble that or slow down to catch it, he might get the first down, but he's not turning the corner and basically ending the game the way that he did. So, what we're seeing from Doug Baldwin in the last 3 weeks or so, I think it's the best stretch of football he's ever played. And if that keeps going, I mean, that opens up a lot of things.
Yeah, that play in particular was pretty cool. It was the Seahawks knew before the snap, based on whatever the alignments and everything, that the Pittsburgh Steelers were in man free. So then essentially everyone was manned up except for the free safety in the backside. Doug Baldwin said after the game he signaled to Russell Wilson before the snap, whatever they do, to say, hey, hit me. And so he ran his up and crossing route or whatever, like a drag at the sticks essentially. Russell Wilson had to rush it a little bit. He had a guy in his face in front of him, and Baldwin said after the game that he hit it, like the ball came out a little early, and it kind of hit him, and like you said, kind of hit him like in the hip. And he was the one who actually said the ball caught him. That's kind of an expression that he used, like every once in a while, just kind of get lucky, like you come up with a ball even though you probably shouldn't have. Just kind of stuck to him. And so that was pretty cool play just in general. And going back to your point, though, like Doug Baldwin has really stepped up his game. I think someone pointed out over the last 3 weeks, I think he's leading all receivers in yards and catches. And then if you look at the actual yards from the slot, he's actually leading the NFL in receiving yards from the slot, which is crazy because the Seahawks don't really throw the ball as much as most teams, So he is the most prolific slot receiver in the NFL right now.
I mean, he's forcing me to reevaluate who I've thought he was as a player.
Yeah.
I've always really liked what he does on the field, but I've always just thought that he was kind of the biggest fish in a small receiver pond.
Right.
The last month of football is really forcing me to challenge that. And, I mean, if you're not lucking your way into leading the NFL in slot receiving yardage on a team that passes it less than everybody else. Like, that's a truly special thing that he's doing right now.
Yeah, he's been really, really good. I think you had mentioned, I think, a couple of weeks ago that his catch rate is highest of all receivers as well, like in terms of...
Yeah, I think so. If he's not number one, he is way, way up there in terms of since they started tracking drops.
Yeah,
that's funny. Golden Tate is the other guy who's right at the top. But Doug Baldwin is elite when it comes to if it hits him in the hands, he catches it. And every quarterback is going to look better with a guy like that. So I got to give credit where it's due. Doug Baldwin is impressing the shit out of me right now.
And I think a lot of that goes to Russell Wilson too. Like, I think you have to credit Wilson for the way he's been playing. Russell now in the NFL is third in yards per attempt among all quarterbacks, behind Carson Palmer and Ben Roethlisberger.
Yeah, I was going to say it has to be those two.
Crazy. And those offenses, think about those offenses.
Yeah, man. Like in your mind, when you just think about that, the gap between those offenses, especially passing, and the Seahawks,
and the weapons,
enormous. Yeah, but I mean that's amazing. I mean, I ran the numbers for my article, and over the last 2 weeks, he's completing 73% of his passes for 9.5 yards an attempt, 8 touchdowns, no interceptions. Like that's a passer efficiency of 141.
Yeah,
that's no joke. Those are legit numbers that, if not sustainable at that pace, I think that he can do for the rest of the season, especially with the defenses coming up, something close to what he's been doing the last 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah, this game versus Minnesota, I mean, that defense is very different and much more structurally sound than what Pittsburgh does, but it's going to give them there'll be opportunities again to get this kind of chunk yardage, and chunk yardage is what Seattle's passing game is all about. They're not a dink and dunk offense, and they never have been. I mean, go back to when Pete first got here and we were in the playoffs at 7-9, and on 3rd and 12s in the playoffs, they're throwing deep to Brandon Stokely and Mike Williams and stuff. This is an offense and a passing philosophy of getting chunk yardage. We're really seeing the timing on those turn out really well lately.
Yeah, it's going to be something that, I mean, We all have recency bias, right? We all assume that how a team has been playing is how a team will play moving forward. And while Seattle has a second half track record of showing that they can sustain this, you don't want to assume that that's going to happen. But it is kind of nice for me to see an offensive identity that isn't super Marshawn centric, because we always knew that the end was going to come. And I've always been worried about the offense's ability to adapt to not having Marshawn Lynch just go out and win one-on-one battles 30 times a game. And it's really cool to see the ways that they're showing that they can have that success without it. On the other side of things, the defense is really curious this year, because whenever they play a middling to low-ranked quarterback, they're not just good. I mean, they're better against those quarterbacks than everybody else is. I mean, they are completely dominating, like they're going against a practice squad. But good quarterbacks have beaten them consistently. And I wonder, is this, and Matt, I want to know from you first, is this a defense that can beat good passing offenses? Because if they do make the playoffs, they're going to have to if they want to get back to the Super Bowl.
Yes, it's a defense that can beat good passing offense, but it's not a defense that's going to choke out a good passing offense like we've seen in the past. We're seeing good passing offenses be, let's take away this game and let's take away the Cardinals game. Good passing offenses, for the most part, have not done. They don't have the explosive ability of these last two teams. The Bengals got them on a long play that Kerry Williams got beat on, and Tyler Eifert. But really, other than that, their passing didn't torch Seattle. But teams are realizing that, you know what, they're not the big bullies that they were, that there are ways to attack a cover 3 or a cover 1 defense, and they're going right at them, which is really, really smart on the other teams, for the other team's coaching to do. But this is still a very, very good defense. I mean, they were number 2 in the NFL going into this game, and now they get a chance to go against, a great running game. They haven't faced a really, really good running game lately, so now they get to go against probably the best running back in the NFL. And then they get to see the broken down Baltimore Ravens and the Austin Davis-led Browns, which, you face these 3 offenses in a row, and statistically you jump from 9th possibly back up into the top 3. So, again, this one game was not pretty. The defense didn't do a lot of the things that we're accustomed to them doing, and we saw them get beat deep. But there's still the talent there to be a very, very, very good defense. And in the NFL, when everything is geared towards the offense, if you can be still an elite top 5 defense, you're going to put yourself in a position to win every game.
Am I crazy in thinking that maybe the main linchpin, if there is one, and it's never just one, but one of the main factors in the drop-off defensively is Earl Thomas? And I'll say that I think Earl Thomas is probably my favorite Seahawks. He might be my favorite Seahawks player of all time. I'm a huge Earl Thomas fan. But if he didn't have his reputation, I don't know how we'd think of him if all we had to go off of was his performance this year. Am I crazy in thinking that?
I don't think you are. I mean, I think he struggled in this last game in particular. And actually, Pete Carroll, I don't know if he was prompted or asked about it or whatever, but he actually said, he kind of was critical of Earl Thomas today and saying he was trying too hard. He was out of position on a couple of plays. He said that specific play where Marcus Wheaton scored the touchdown, I think he was actually supposed to be back helping out. He said the safeties are supposed to take care of that. Safeties in this scheme have the post and the seam, right? And that was exactly what that was. And I think he reacted to the scramble or something like that. That's what Pete Carroll said. So that was kind of what happened. But, I mean, the nice thing is Earl Thomas, we know what he can do. And if he gets back to kind of how he has been over the last couple of years in the stretch run, and he kind of starts getting, back to what we know he can do, the defense could take a big jump. I think you're completely right. I was thinking about that even before you brought it up, that part of the reason I think the defense has struggled a little bit is because of Earl hasn't really been himself. So if he gets back to kind of how we know he can play and stops trying to be such a playmaker necessarily and just play within the scheme, I think the defense could really improve. And it's I mean, Matt knows this. Like in the NFL and in any level of football, everything is so interconnected. Like Earl Thomas has said, it's like everyone's on a string. So if one guy's out of position, the whole thing kind of collapses within itself, and you can't guard everything in a scheme. And so you have to be very precise. And I think the reason they've given up some big plays is because you have some of your all pros that are not very precise right now. I actually tweeted that during the game. It sucks when some of your best players are giving up plays kind of consistently. So the good news is we can believe that these guys are going to figure it out because they are multiple all-pro players, and they've proven it time and time again that they're really, really good players. And so in that sense, I'm excited about kind of where their defense is going to go going forward, and if they can kind of figure it out.
Yeah.
Go ahead. No, please go ahead.
What I was going to say is it's hard to see Earl not make plays that we've become accustomed to seeing him make for the last several years. Not just he had one good year and now we're having a bit of a drop-off.
Right.
Earl has made consistently good plays for so long. I think the other part of this that's kind of hurting the defense is that interior pass rush. We're not getting a ton of pressure from up inside, and we're not getting the sacks like we had with Jordan Hill last year, Clinton McDonald, Brandon Mebane before he went down. We're not getting that great surge up the middle, which is something that surge up the middle makes a quarterback really uncomfortable. And being a former center, I always knew that if I got bull rushed back into my quarterback, our whole passing game was going to be thrown off because he was going to have to adjust in the pocket and not get his typical launching point. So because we're not able to get these rush from between the two guards up into the quarterback's face, I think it's giving them that half a second longer to be able to throw some of these deeper patterns and some of these deeper pass plays. And because of that, our linebackers are not in a position where they need to be. And it's just kind of that trigger effect of it just rolling downhill. And I think, it is all interconnected. But that interior pass rush that we saw last year just hasn't been there this year.
Yeah, I was thinking about the Seahawks defense, and it's weird because we collectively have spent almost no time this season talking about Cliff Avril. And I think that Cliff Avril has been the best player on this defense all season. He's beating everybody to the quarterback. I mean, I think Michael Bennett would have more sacks if it wasn't for Cliff Avril. Like there have been 2 or 3 where, Bennett's about to add 1 to his total and Avril just wins the sprint there. Like it's really an amazing thing that we're seeing from him. And for all the deficiencies that, or at least perceived deficiencies of the defense and all the guys that we think aren't playing as well as they have in the past, I think that what we're seeing from Cliff Avril is worthy of comment at least because I think that he's been the catalyst for them.
Absolutely. He's been like one of the most disruptive defensive ends in the NFL, and that says a lot just based on some of the star power at defensive end in the NFL. I mean, if you just talk about all the studs like, Justin Houston or Robert Quinn or whoever, like all the way across the league, there's all these like superstar defensive ends, and Cliff Avril rarely gets mentioned among those. And in terms of the 4-3 defense, like I think he's leading the NFL or leading all 4-3s in terms of pressures and QB hits and all that. So he's obviously doing something right, and it all comes down to he's one of the quickest guys off the snap I've ever seen. He just has a weird explosion, like he's able to explode at the snap, like past right tackle, so it just makes him look stupid. And he's really, really good at I love that he always does this. He gets his hand on the elbow of the passer and breaks up passes a lot like that, and that can create turnovers and all that. So, yeah, he's just playing really awesome right now.
Yeah, good. I just wanted that to be like mentioned because like I said, when I was thinking about it, it's amazing to me how good Cliff Avril's been, and I realized I have spent almost no time writing or talking about him all season, and
Yeah.
he's been excellent, and I think that, like you guys were both saying, obviously everything that's done on a football field is super interconnected, and I think that the pass rush has a lot to do with the success of a secondary. The difference between a quarterback having 2 seconds or having 2.5 seconds is all the difference in the world in terms of his ability to go through his reads and receivers getting open and all of that. So definitely, I've started paying more keen attention to him lately, and I'm just super impressed by him. So, really, really just wanted to kind of point that out. Before we finish out here, I did want to look ahead to this Minnesota game, and we kind of talked about some things earlier on. But, Matt, what do you see when you look at the Vikings? What do you see in terms of their ability to beat the Seahawks? Can they do it, and if so, how would they go about it?
Yes, they can beat the Seahawks. And honestly, in the NFL, unless you're down to your third string quarterback, any team can win. I mean, we saw the 49ers come awfully close to beating the Cardinals last week.
Yeah.
It's just one of those things in the NFL you never know. The Adrian Peterson is going to be the big key, and how can we contain him? I went to the game a couple of years ago at the Clink when Percy and Adrian were on the field for Minnesota. In the first play of the game, Adrian goes 80 yards for a touchdown, and I'm sitting there going, oh, crap, we got no chance today. And the defense did a great job and rallied around it and stuffed him. We have to limit his large runs because he's going to get 4, 5, and 6 yards, but we need to follow up when he gets a 6-yard run with a no-yard run. And then he gets a 3-yard run, we need to follow it up with a 2-yard run. We can't let him have the 8s and then 12 and then 6 and then 5s. We have to be able to limit his yardage. It's going to be a huge test for our defensive line and our linebackers because we're not the largest linebacking crew in the NFL. And this is a very run-heavy Minnesota Vikings team. Cam Chancellor, I think, is going to have a great game because we're probably going to have that 8th man in the box quite a bit. The Minnesota offensive line is very good. They're very large and they're very powerful. So it's going to create some interesting matchups for us. I thought Ty Rubin's been doing a nice job all year long. I don't think Mebane is getting quite the statistics that we're used to seeing, but he's been playing very well. Signing A.J. Francis back from the practice squad. Again, they're trying to beef up that D-line you can see this week and getting another 3 technique in there. So we're really going to have to be able to shut down the run and let our corners just kind of jam the men and play a mano a mano out there and see what happens. As far as the Minnesota defense going, I heard Pete Carroll talk a little bit today about how they like to run a lot of their base defense. And Mike Zimmer's always been a very good defensive coach. Back to his days when he was the Cincinnati defensive coordinator. They've always had very good defenses, and he's brought that philosophy to Minnesota. So this is going to be early kickoff, outdoor game in Minnesota in December. There's going to be a lot of obstacles for the Seahawks, but this is one of the games that, again, they need to win to show that they are a team that should be in the playoffs.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and it's funny, even though Minnesota has a 2-game lead on the Seahawks currently, if the Seahawks win this one, it's only 1 and they have the tiebreaker. So it's basically only a half-game difference the rest of the way. And Minnesota actually has a really difficult final schedule. They actually, by DVOA, have the 2nd toughest remaining schedule. So this win is big for them because I don't think there's a lot of margin for error for them down the stretch, and and I think that they'll obviously be aware of that. I think for me, when I look at this Vikings team, on a per play basis in terms of actual efficacy per play, there's no team in the NFL with a bigger split between rushing and passing. They are 25th in the NFL in passing, 4th in rushing. And that's not, this is one of the cool things about DVOA is it's not based on raw totals, right? That's not 25th in passing yardage. That's 25th in effectiveness per pass. And I think that this is the exact type of team that Seattle is built to beat. If you win by running the ball, Seattle has shown every single year, really without lapse, that they can take away a running back. The only teams that have really had success running against them in the last 4 years are teams where the quarterback is a running threat. Alex Smith had a nice rushing game, and Danny and I were talking earlier about how underrated he is as a rusher. Cam Newton allows the Panthers to run the ball really well against the Seahawks. Kaepernick early on, same thing. Those were the teams that were able to beat the Seahawks on the ground. You don't see running backs come in and have those type of games where they take over. If anyone can, obviously it's Adrian Peterson. But I think that this is a game where Seattle can go 8 in the box and force Teddy Bridgewater to beat them. And if he does, I mean, God bless him. They'll have earned it. But I think that Seattle has a better ability on offense to adapt if what they want to do, which is lean on the run and pass off of play action and all of that, if that gets taken away, I think that Seattle is better equipped to adjust to it and take advantage of Minnesota's defense. The Minnesota is equipped to make that same adjustment and take advantage of Seattle's defense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think we talked about on the other podcast. I think they're built to play this kind of team, and obviously, like Matt said, anybody can beat anybody in any given week. But I like this matchup. I think the Seahawks are kind of they're well equipped for this kind of game. Last week I was a little less sure and we saw what happened. Like the Steelers just throw the ball deep so well and just attack all over. I don't see the Vikings being able to do that. I don't think Bridgewater hasn't necessarily played all that great this year, and he's not necessarily. I just don't see him throwing it over the Seahawks' head too much this week. So I think they're built for this. If they can keep Peterson in check, they don't even have to they don't have to like quote stop him. If they can keep him in check, they'll be just fine.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see. And if the Seahawks do win this, I mean, yes, they can still catch the Cardinals. I'm not banking on that. But I think that the difference this year between the 5th and the 6th seed is really, really, really big. If you get the 6th seed, which Seattle, that's the position Seattle is currently in, you're probably going to Green Bay or to Minnesota. I still think Green Bay takes that division. And winning a playoff game in Lambeau is a much different story than winning a playoff game at Dallas or at Washington or at the Giants or at Philadelphia right now. I mean, the leader of the NFC East, the winner of the NFC East is going to get the 4 seed and play the 5 seed in the first round. Right now, the leader of that division is 5 and 6. So I do think that if Green Bay catches Minnesota, which I think looking at remaining schedule and just overall talent, I think that they will. This beating Minnesota may be the difference between going to Green Bay or going to Washington, and I think that matters a great deal. So this game I think carries a lot of weight, and because the range of playoff spots that Seattle is going to get is only 2 this year.
Absolutely.
Great point, Jackson. Totally agree.
No, absolutely. This team is starting to get their mojo back and is playing well. But this is one of those games that we need to see them come out and win to really know where we're at. I mean, a 7-5 record is a hell of a lot better than a 6-6 record. So if this team wants to show that they can get to the playoffs and then make the run, these are the type of games that they have to go out and win.
Yeah, no question about it. Honestly, it's nice to get back to the feeling of someone that watches the Seahawks, every week and follows them, reports on them, whatever it is that we do. It's nice to have that feeling of optimism back. And this was sort of the swing game on the schedule for me in terms of, referring to the Steelers game. It was kind of the swing game on the schedule for me coming out of the bye, as it expected them to beat the 49ers. You knew the Cardinals would be tough. Can they go beat a team like Pittsburgh and set themselves up and seeing them win and seeing them be able to adapt to a totally different game flow than what they've been comfortable with was really encouraging. So hopefully we'll have more optimism to talk about next week. Anything either you guys want to add before we sign off?
No, you said it.
It's going to be a fun one. It's going to be a good game. I'm looking forward to this one.
Yeah, I think so. Beating the Vikings is a totally different thing than beating the Steelers in terms of approach. So show some versatility if they can pull off both of those wins. So for Danny Kelly, for Matt Nichols, this is Jackson Bevins. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next week.